having no other option but to leave, as homes and livelihoods are destroyed before their eyes. These fiery scenes are just 45 minutes south of Athens. Horses are being removed from their stables. People are getting away from the dangerous flames engulfing their neighborhood. Text messages from authorities earlier in the day telling them that where they were was no longer safe. Over in Spain, a similar picture. Firefighters here setting a blaze to contain one. A fire that's caused thousands to flee the island of La Palma in the Canaries and left wrecked homes in its path. This used to be Alfonso Ballesteros' kitchen. His oven is barely recognizable.
I
told my wife to dress the children calmly, that the fire would take time to arrive. But after 10 seconds, I had to tell her to grab the children naked if necessary. The fire is already here. I had to leave my house because I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see anything.
This is Europe on what's set to be its hottest week ever recorded. And in the US, a relentless heat wave shows no signs of letting up. It's usually hot in Death Valley, California. But this is be careful of what you touch hot.
Yeah, watch out, don't touch that metal.
With officials seeing it get more extreme.
Death Valley is definitely getting hotter. 7 of Death Valley's hottest summers, of Death Valley's top 10 hottest summers happened just in the last 10 years.
What are your expectations with your China visit?
With scenes of climate catastrophe unfolding for the world to see, the two biggest emitters, the United States and China, responsible for 40% of global greenhouse gases, are meeting today, and all eyes are on their climate negotiators. John Kerry being in Beijing is a welcome sign for US-China relations. He's the third official to go in the last few months. Both sides say that they are cooperating, but in reality, they are far apart. The US is calling for China to adopt more ambitious targets and also reduce its use of coal, while China is asking for tariff restrictions on solar panels to be removed. And they also don't want any restrictions getting in the way of economic growth. Economic growth may be of little comfort to those currently enduring China's heat wave right now. Record temperatures of over 50 degrees Celsius seen in Xinjiang. All this as the United Nations warned that Europe's heat wave is likely to continue into August, sparking yet more wildfire risks as extreme temperatures start to become the new normal.
Aisha Tal reporting from Washington. Well, Rachel Kite is Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University and has advised different governments and financial institutions on climate change. She joined me earlier from Ahmedabad in India. I started by asking her whether she expected us to see these extreme temperatures so soon.
I think so. It's a cumulative impact of a sort of blanket around the Earth, which stops which has been caused by our pollution and which stops the heat escaping. And then we have an El Nino, a regular climate event over the top, the warming of the oceans, which is intensifying it. So now all of those plans for cooling centers, for making your grid resilient so that your hospitals can run electricity safely, with air conditioning that needs to be non-polluting and cheap for people on low-income wages, that is all now top of the agenda.
I mean, there are some people around the world who are, sweltering in this heat, who are desperate, who are throwing their hands up in despair, saying there's nothing we can do.
Well, there are short-term things that can do, which involve local authorities and governments and the private sector all working together. So you have to create cool zones in towns so that people can get out of the heat. We need to be able to put new rules in place so that people are not working outside and that people understand how dangerous it is. But in the long run, we have to find ways to keep ourselves cool without further polluting the planet.
And immediately, we can't just wait for another few years. This has to be done, this year, next year.
Yes, I mean, we're going to see the repeated heat waves in every region of the world. And, if you're wealthy and you live in a leafy suburb, you can perhaps get by if the electricity doesn't go out on you. But if you're poor and you're living in a concrete jungle, which is sort of intensifying the heat island effect, we call it, then it's miserable.
I mean, if this continues, if this is indeed the new normal, society will change in so many different ways. Everything will have to be rethought.
Yeah, the way we design cities and build them, the materials that we build them with, how we heat and cool buildings and cities, how we make sure we don't waste heat in order to create cooling. All of these things will need to be thought through, and those technologies and that thinking is in place.
So there's a bit of diplomacy going on as well, which might be hopeful. You've got John Kerry on his third visit to Beijing now, and you've got China's climate envoy Cher talking to him. Does that give you hope that the world's two biggest polluters might find common ground here?
Well, I think it's critically important that despite the tensions between China and the United States, that the climate envoys and their bosses are allowing there to be a zone of cooperation on climate change. I think it's also important that they're going to look for pragmatic solutions that they can move forward. And I think there's a focus on methane. Methane is an accelerant. It is a sort of super pollutant. It speeds up climate change. And if we can get to an agreement about zero methane emissions, then that's very important.
Finally, and very briefly, we've spoken on several occasions in the past, and you were always cautiously optimistic that change might come about. Are you still?
The solutions are there. The technological solutions are there. I'm in Ahmedabad right now with all of the finance ministers of the G20. The money's there as well. The question is how we organize ourselves to invest it properly and how we get away from the sort of short-termism and the sort of climate denialism that John Kerry had to face in US Congress last week.
Rachel Kite, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I also spoke to Victor Gao, who is vice president of the Beijing-based think tank, the Center for China and Globalization. I asked him whether John Kerry's Beijing visit could signal the beginnings of a climate deal between the world's two biggest polluters.
His visit is important in the sense that indeed, in order to rally the world together in the fight against the negative impact of the climate change, China and the United States need to do something together. They need to join hands rather than getting at each other's jugular. Now, China is indeed the largest emitter. However, on a per capita basis, the United States is a much larger emitter than China. And the energy intensity of the US economy and the US society at large is much higher than that of China. Therefore, I think it is time for both China and the United States to get their acts together, to do the right thing, rather than, for example, what the United States did in bailing itself out of the Paris Climate Change Accord. And I hope the United States will never do that kind of thing again. And China and the United States working together about the climate change is the only right thing to do going forward.
Okay, but we are trying to avoid jugulars, aren't we? So what about China building more coal power plants when we know that coal is part of the problem?
Indeed, China's pronouncement has already been clearly made. That is, by 2030, China needs to be neutral as far as emission is concerned. And then China, by 2060, should be a zero emission at all. Therefore, I think China will continue to do the right thing. China has already announced major halts or suspensions of the newly constructed coal-based power stations. And on the other hand, given the fact that China has the largest coal reserve in the world, and coal today still accounts for about 55% of the energy mix in China, despite of all the efforts to bring that down. And I hope China in the coming years will reduce the dependence on coal to below 50%. So there is still a long way to go. And I hope by 2030, China will no longer need to build any more coal power plants. China has also announced that it is stopping financing any newly built coal-fired power plants outside of China. So you need to look at the whole picture together.
If China and America do not settle their differences, whether it's through climate change or other issues, what are the consequences going to be for the rest of the planet?
Let us be realistic. China and the United States will always have differences. However, the differences should not be what divide them. The differences should be what unite them. And on major issues like the climate change, there should be no major differences. China and the United States need to do the right thing together, because otherwise we are going to suffer the consequences together. On the other hand, the United States need to firmly acknowledge that China is a power on the par with the United States, And the United States can never do anything in its own capacity or rallying its allies to get China down to the ground. That's not possible. The United States need to acknowledge that. The sooner it does so, it is better for the United States as well as for mankind as a whole.
You want to be treated like an equal by the Americans?
China is an equal of the United States. Whether the United States acknowledge that or not, that's another thing. If it does not acknowledge that, it will suffer the consequences for its own misjudgment.
Okay. On that note, Victor Gao, thank you very much.
谢谢.
Well, more now on the government's plan to deal with the climate crisis. It was released a day earlier than they'd intended after it was leaked to a newspaper, but it's already been criticised for not doing enough to protect the UK from the extreme heat.
There will always be more that needs to be done, but what we have set out today in our National Adaptation Plan is how we have taken the 61 risks identified by the Climate Change Committee and worked cross-government, but also with society, including local authorities, to adapt to those risks. And we've also set out billions of pounds of investment for the most vulnerable in society.
Well, joining me now is the Green MP, Caroline Lucas. Thanks for coming back on the programme, Caroline Lucas. I don't know if you had a chance to read the government's adaptation plan. It's a bit of a laundry list. You know, is it enough in your mind?
Well, what I've seen of it suggests it's absolutely not enough. It is deeply disappointing and really lacking in ambition. What we've had served up to us here is announcements that have been pre-announced about 2 years ago, so they're being recycled now. We've got the government talking about doing research to work out why and how buildings overheat instead of actually putting in place the measures to address it. And we've got a government that simply doesn't understand the role of nature restoration in being able to properly adapt to climate change. Its own climate change advisors said as recently as March that the government is strikingly unprepared for adaptation issues, and unfortunately, just a few months later, this report absolutely underlines that concern.
Do you think the government's actually gone backwards since COP26 in Glasgow in terms of its kind of rhetorical commitments to what needs to be done?
I think that's unquestionably the case, and it's not just on the rhetoric. What we're also seeing, of course, is this is a government that is giving the green light to 100 new oil and gas licences in the North Sea. It's a government that is giving around 10 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel companies. It's a government that is giving a green light to a new coal mine. So the idea of this government as a climate leader, I'm afraid now is a bad joke. What they have to do is to turn this around really quickly. And one of the first ways they could do that would be to back amendments to the Levelling Up Bill that would properly make nature restoration a legal requirement.
What we could just hear now was, of course, the division bell, not a fire alarm. So I know you've got to go in a minute. We've got a few more minutes with you. I mean, there it is again. The paper is called Adaptation. Do you think, speaking philosophically, this is the big change now, that we're trying to adapt to ways that we can live with climate change instead of actually changing climate change, getting rid of it?
Well, we need to do both, of course, and nothing in this document or nothing about the importance of adaptation takes away the importance of the mitigation of trying to reduce the impacts of climate change, because every fraction of a degree matters, every tonne of CO2 matters. But having said that, anybody who's living through what's happening now in countries like Greece and Spain or the United States, anyone who remembers what it was like in the UK almost exactly a year ago when we busted through that 40-degree threshold here in the UK will know that climate change is not some distant threat. It is real, and it's here, and it's now. And that is why this government's adaptation plan is so utterly failing. It does not rise to the urgency that this issue requires.
They would, of course, say that they've looked at this very carefully. They've looked at lots of practical ways of dealing with this, and they've got to be realistic. What works politically here?
I don't think the planet is going to take a lot of notice into what it thinks a particular government in a particular country thinks is politically realistic. The role of government is to change what is politically possible. The role of government is to show some real leadership here. The laws of nature that are driving climate change are not going to respect whether or not the government thinks it's got the money to invest in this. The bottom line is that the role of government is to protect its people. Right now, it does that by investing in the climate challenge.
Just finally, is there a problem with democratically elected governments across Europe, across the world, that if they want to force through the kind of change that science demands is necessary, they are afraid of never getting re-elected again?
Listen, there is nothing not to like about a massive investment in retrofitting homes so that they are warm in winter and cool in the summer. There is nothing not to like about making public transport more affordable and more accessible. All of these policies that we need in the transition to a greener economy are ones that are good for individuals themselves. Unfortunately, in this country, we have a government that wasn't actually elected by a majority of people, thanks to our unfair electoral system. But nonetheless, if they present them properly, these are vote winners as well as climate winners.
Caroline Lucas, got to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.